Welcome to episode 4 of Forgotten Recipes of America. Today, we're uncovering something you've likely never heard before. In this episode, we dive deep into the forgotten casseroles that once kept struggling families fed and warm across America. These weren't just meals, they were lifelines crafted from scraps, hope, and a whole lot of creativity. We're talking about dishes born from hardship, designed to stretch pennies and fill hungry bellies, using whatever was left in the pantry. From canned mystery meat to day-old bread, what you're about to hear might sound strange today, but back then, these casseroles meant survival. Some of these recipes disappeared completely. Others were whispered through generations before vanishing altogether. But today, we're bringing them back. So stay with us till the end, because we're revealing 15 of the most forgotten casseroles that saved working-class dinners across America, and some of them will truly shock you. Get ready for a journey of flavors, history, and survival, one casserole at a time. The casserole that carried families through the cold. As we step back into those challenging times, where every meal was a quiet triumph, we begin with one of the humblest, yet most beloved dishes, the potato and onion bake. This wasn't just food. It was survival in a dish. In countless working-class homes during the Great Depression and World War II, potatoes and onions were the last two things left when everything else ran out. Cheap, long-lasting, and easy to grow in backyard plots or empty lots, they became staples in the kitchens of coal miners, factory workers, and railway men, the unsung backbone of America. Families would slice the potatoes thin, layer them with onions, and add whatever they could spare, maybe a splash of milk, a cube of lard, or some bacon drippings saved in an old tin. Everything was reused, nothing was wasted. Sometimes, stale breadcrumbs were added on top for texture. The dish was slowly baked until the potatoes softened and the onions caramelized, releasing an aroma that filled the house with comfort, even when hope was scarce. But what made this casserole truly unforgettable wasn't just its simplicity, it was the way it brought families together. Parents would dish out equal portions, making sure everyone got a little, even when there wasn't enough. It was a quiet ritual, repeated night after night in towns like Flint, Toledo, and Pittsburgh. Over time, as America's economy recovered and processed foods became common, this dish faded away, replaced by boxed meals and frozen dinners. But for those who lived it, the memory of this casserole still brings warmth and a tear. And it was only the beginning, because what came next was a dish that pretended to be something it wasn't, and fooled even the hungriest of stomachs. When survival needed a clever disguise. Following the humble potato and onion bake, we move into a dish that perfectly illustrates the ingenuity born from necessity, the mock chicken casserole. During the hardest years of the Depression and war, actual chicken was a rare luxury for many working-class families. But hunger didn't wait. So, households got creative, transforming everyday ingredients into meals that looked and tasted like something far richer. The mock chicken casserole was crafted from simple staples, often canned tuna or leftover scraps of meat, combined with potatoes, onions, and a basic white sauce made from flour, water, and a splash of milk or broth. Sometimes, breadcrumbs or crushed crackers were sprinkled on top to add a golden crust, mimicking the comforting texture of roasted chicken. This casserole wasn't just a meal, it was a deception designed to uplift spirits. To children, it might have seemed like a feast. To parents, it was a small victory, turning scarcity into sustenance with a sprinkle of hope. Recipes for this dish were passed down quietly, often shared between neighbors in tight-knit communities where resources were scarce, but camaraderie was strong. It became a symbol of resilience, proof that even when the pantry was nearly bare, families could still sit down to a special dinner. Though the mock chicken casserole eventually vanished from mainstream cookbooks, its legacy lives on in stories told by grandparents, tales of resourcefulness that shaped a generation. But the ingenuity didn't stop here. Next, we'll uncover the secret behind the tuna noodle surprise, another casserole that brought flavor and fullness to the most frugal tables. Stay with us. A creamy classic born from ration books and hope. As we continue our journey through the forgotten kitchens of working-class America, we arrive at one of the most widely remembered yet often misunderstood casseroles of the era, the tuna noodle surprise. This dish wasn't born in a fancy cookbook. It emerged straight from the chaos of wartime rationing, When protein was scarce, dairy was precious, and every meal had to do more with less. The surprise wasn't a secret ingredient. It was the fact that such basic ingredients could come together to create something so comforting, creamy, and filling. At its core were just a few essentials: egg noodles, canned tuna, and condensed soup, often cream of mushroom or celery. A splash of milk stretched the sauce further, while peas or chopped celery, if available, added texture. If a family had access to cheese, it became a luxury topping. And if not, a crunchy finish came from crushed potato chips, breadcrumbs, or even cereal. But behind the casserole dish was a larger story. Housewives clipped coupons and traded ration stamps for cans of tuna. Children stirred the noodles while mothers juggled endless chores. These casseroles weren't just about dinner. They were about stability, routine, and love in uncertain times. Tuna noodle surprise became a symbol of how American kitchens adapted, combining shelf-stable ingredients in ways that created not just food, but comfort. Though it eventually became a school lunch cliché in later decades, its roots lie in survival, thrift, and maternal care. And as we move forward, our next dish takes a sharp turn, to the leftovers no one wanted, until they were reborn in a crusty, flavorful, oven-baked miracle. When last night's scraps became tonight's lifesaver. As we turn the page from the creamy comfort of tuna noodle surprise, we step into a dish that truly defined resilience: the leftover meatloaf hash bake. This wasn't just a casserole. It was an act of transformation, born not from choice, but from necessity. During the Great Depression and through the wartime 1940s, meat was scarce, and nothing could be wasted. Every bite of food had to serve more than one purpose. That's where yesterday's meatloaf became today's miracle. Leftover slices were crumbled or cubed, then tossed with boiled potatoes, onions, and bits of whatever vegetables were on hand: carrots, cabbage, even turnip tops. Some families stirred in leftover gravy or a splash of milk to stretch it. The mixture was packed into a greased baking dish, topped with stale breadcrumbs or a sprinkle of flour and lard, then baked until golden and crisp. The result? A dish that filled bellies and warmed homes, even if it never appeared in a cookbook. But what made this hash bake so special wasn't just its taste. It was what it represented: a refusal to give in to hardship. A mother stretching a single loaf across 3 days. A grandmother turning a spoonful of gravy into something that tasted rich. A father returning from long hours at the mill to a hot, humble meal, grateful for what little they had. These were the quiet victories of working-class kitchens, places where resourcefulness trumped recipes and survival required daily innovation. And as rationing tightened and meat became even more elusive, families would soon start leaning on plant-based casseroles, hearty, earthy, and full of life from the backyard garden, turning garden scraps into a family feast. As meat grew scarce and every slice had to stretch across days, working-class families pivoted toward plant-based solutions, and one dish rose as a quiet champion of survival: the cabbage and rice oven bake. This humble casserole was born from gardens and grit. Cabbage, a cold, hardy, inexpensive vegetable, grew in almost every backyard, or what folks called victory gardens during the war. Rice, though imported, was cheap when bought in bulk and could expand meals exponentially. When money ran thin, this combo was a lifesaver. In many homes, the process was simple: shred cabbage finely, sauté it with onions and garlic in lard or saved bacon drippings, then stir in cooked rice and a spoonful of tomato paste or crushed canned tomatoes if available. Seasoned with salt, pepper, and perhaps a pinch of dried thyme, the mixture was packed into a dish, topped with crumbs or grated cheese, if one could afford it, then baked until the top browned and the inside bubbled. But what this dish lacked in luxury, it made up for in comfort. It was warm, filling, easy on the wallet, and best of all, it created leftovers that reheated well for the next day's lunch, which, in those days, was more than anyone could ask for. For immigrant families in America, this dish echoed the flavors of Eastern Europe, Italy, and beyond. It reminded them of home, or at least what home used to be, making it a comforting connection to the past in a time full of uncertainty. While modern kitchens have long forgotten this bake, in the 1930s and 40s, it was a staple. a symbol of how a few simple ingredients could come together to create not just a meal, but a moment of togetherness. When there was no chicken, but the spirit remained. As the Great Depression dug in deeper and meat became a rare luxury, families were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The beloved Sunday roast or fried chicken dinner was becoming a memory. Yet, out of that longing came one of the most creative dishes of the era, the mock chicken casserole. What made it mock was the complete absence of poultry. But what made it beloved was the ingenious way it tasted like the real thing. This casserole was born out of desperation but shaped by imagination. Women who had once cooked hearty meals for coal miners, railroad workers, and factory men now had to work with scraps and substitutes, and this dish proved just how far culinary creativity could stretch. The heart of the recipe involved stale bread or biscuits, soaked in milk or broth, then combined with eggs, finely chopped celery, a pinch of sage, and onions sautéed in fat, lard if they had it, margarine if they didn't. The mixture was stirred together and baked until it turned golden and firm, almost like stuffing. But with the right seasoning, it had the flavor and mouthfeel that mimicked a chicken bake. In some communities, crushed crackers or cornflakes were added on top for a crispy finish. And when families managed to get a spoonful of drippings or leftover gravy, it transformed the meal into something close to sacred. This was more than food. It was resilience baked into a casserole dish. It told children, we may not have what we want, but we still have something warm, filling, and made with love. In many homes, the dish was so cherished that it stuck around even after times improved, passed down quietly in recipe boxes. And so, mock chicken casserole became a symbol, not of what people lacked, but of how they endured. The crustless supper that carried families through. As the 1930s rolled on, families who once celebrated dinner with meatloaf and roast beef now clung tightly to the basics, and yet, they refused to let dignity slip from their tables. When even flour for pie crusts became too precious to waste, families adapted. What emerged was the humble yet unforgettable potato and onion pie, a dish that, while missing a crust, never lacked in comfort. This wasn't a pie in the traditional sense. There was no flaky pastry, no butter, no meat. But what it did have was heart. Thinly sliced potatoes and onions were layered lovingly in a greased baking dish, each layer seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and maybe a hint of thyme if it could be spared. The layering itself felt almost ceremonial, a moment of care in chaotic times. Some families would drizzle a little evaporated milk or bacon grease between layers to add richness. If there was cheese, even a scrap, it was considered gold and grated on top. It was then baked slowly, allowing the onions to soften, the potatoes to crisp at the edges, and the layers to bond together in a hearty, cohesive dish. What came out of the oven was more than a pie. It was a symbol of survival. The scent alone could bring children rushing to the table. They'd gather around, eyes wide, ready to share in a meal that might have had no meat but had everything else: warmth, flavor, and love. It was a dish that fed without fuss, offering nourishment during a time when even that wasn't guaranteed. And though many forgot it as times improved, for those who lived through those days, potato and onion pie remained unforgettable. How leftover bread and beans became a community staple. When every crumb counted, the resourcefulness of working-class kitchens knew no bounds. Enter the bean and bread crumble, a dish born from the need to stretch meager ingredients into something satisfying and nutritious. Beans, affordable, filling, and packed with protein, became a cornerstone of Depression-era diets, but they were rarely eaten alone. This casserole combined stale bread, often torn or crumbled by hand, with cooked beans simmered in a simple tomato sauce or broth. Onions and herbs were sautéed until soft and aromatic, then folded into the mix to add depth and flavor. The bread absorbed the liquid, creating a textured, almost pudding-like base that held the casserole together. The top was sprinkled generously with crumbs or sometimes crushed crackers, adding a crispy, golden finish after baking. For families lucky enough to have a little cheese or leftover bacon, these were added sparingly, enhancing the richness without breaking the bank. What made the bean and bread crumble truly special was its role in bringing communities together. Neighbors often pooled scraps and ingredients, sharing casseroles during gatherings or communal meals, a reminder that survival was a collective effort. This dish wasn't just about filling stomachs, it was about nourishing spirits. Despite its humble origins, the bean and bread crumble symbolized resilience and ingenuity. It was a warm, affordable meal that fed many, often serving as the backbone of family dinners when other options were scarce. From cheap cuts to comfort food, the story of liver and onion bake. During the Depression and beyond, affordable protein was a luxury many families had to stretch to the limit. Enter the liver and onion bake, a dish that transformed inexpensive liver, often overlooked and underestimated, into a hearty, flavorful casserole that could feed a family on a budget. Liver was rich in nutrients but carried a reputation for being tough and strong-flavored. To soften this, cooks would slice it thinly and layer it with sautéed onions and often a simple white sauce or a splash of broth. Sometimes breadcrumbs or crushed crackers were sprinkled on top to add texture and soak up the savory juices. This bake wasn't just about making liver palatable, it was about making it desirable. Families learned to mask bitterness and add tenderness, creating a dish that felt special despite its humble origins. In many households, this casserole became a regular fixture because it offered a substantial, warming meal without the cost of traditional meats. The dish's historical significance lies in its testament to working-class ingenuity, turning what many considered scraps into a source of pride and sustenance. Recipes were often passed down through generations, whispered from mother to daughter, preserving a piece of American culinary heritage that few remember today. A Southern comfort from the garden to the table. In many working-class homes, especially in the South, fresh vegetables from backyard gardens became essential to stretching meals and adding vital nutrients. The cornbread and greens bake was a shining example of this resourcefulness, bringing together humble garden greens and pantry staples into one satisfying casserole. Greens like collards, kale, or mustard greens were boiled down to tender perfection, often seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and a splash of vinegar or hot sauce if available. These were then layered or mixed with crumbled cornbread, a staple made from inexpensive cornmeal. The cornbread acted as a binding agent, soaking up the flavors and juices from the greens while providing a soft, crumbly texture. Some families added a small amount of bacon drippings or leftover fat to boost flavor and richness. Baked slowly until golden and fragrant, this casserole was more than just a meal. It was a celebration of survival and tradition. What makes the cornbread and greens bake special is its link to both African American heritage and Southern working-class kitchens, where recipes were passed down as family treasures. This dish not only filled bellies but also carried stories of resilience, culture, and community that endured through difficult decades. When dessert met survival, the hidden hero of the South. When you think of the Great Depression or the Dust Bowl era, desserts aren't the first thing that come to mind. But even in the leanest times, families found ways to bring a little sweetness to their table, and one of the most cherished creations from working-class kitchens was the sweet potato and molasses bake. Sweet potatoes weren't just common, they were essential. They grew well in poor soil, could be stored for months, and were packed with vitamins, particularly beta-carotene. For many Southern families, they became a daily staple. But when sweet potatoes met molasses, the magic happened. Molasses, a byproduct of sugar refining, was cheaper than white sugar and often more accessible. It added not only sweetness but a deep, rich flavor that turned plain ingredients into something indulgent. Housewives would boil or roast sweet potatoes, mash them with a bit of salt, and stir in dark molasses, sometimes with a touch of lard or butter if they had it. Cinnamon, nutmeg, or cloves, if available, were added sparingly, almost like sacred treasures. Crumbled biscuits, old bread, or flour might be mixed in to help bind it all together. This mixture was then poured into a greased tin pan, sometimes topped with a few pats of butter or breadcrumbs, and baked until the edges caramelized. The result was a casserole that filled the home with a warm, spicy aroma, comforting families during long winters or uncertain nights. But this dish wasn't just about taste. It was about imagination and heart. It showed how even the poorest kitchens could create something that felt like a celebration. Mothers would serve it after a day of hard labor, or as a surprise on Sundays, and for children who rarely tasted sweets, it was like eating gold. the humble layers that carried a family through the storm. Cabbage might not sound glamorous today, but during the harshest years of American history, this simple vegetable was a lifeline for working-class families. In tenement kitchens, countryside cabins, and miner shacks alike, one dish stood out as a belly-filling wonder: the cabbage and rice bake. Why cabbage? Because it was cheap, hearty, and kept well, even without refrigeration. Families could stretch a single head across multiple meals. Paired with plain white rice, another Depression-era staple, cabbage transformed into a surprisingly hearty and satisfying casserole that fed mouths and lifted spirits. The preparation was both practical and inspired. Women would parboil shredded cabbage to soften its bitterness, while cooking rice separately with whatever flavorings they had, perhaps a broth cube, leftover bacon grease, or even just salt and pepper. In many homes, sautéed onions or garlic were added to bring depth, and a beaten egg or spoon of flour helped hold the mixture together. Occasionally, scraps of sausage or crumbled leftover meat would be folded in when luck allowed. Layer by layer, rice and cabbage were spread into a baking pan, often topped with breadcrumbs or crumbled crackers, anything that could form a crust. Then it went into the oven, and what emerged was far greater than the sum of its parts: a golden-topped, savory sweet casserole that was warm, filling, and full of memory. But this wasn't just about eating. It was about survival with dignity. Families took pride in stretching small ingredients into something delicious, and children learned that love could be baked into even the humblest of meals. This dish was passed down through generations in whispers, scrawled on the backs of flour bags or shared over garden fences, and though it vanished from most modern tables, it remains a powerful reminder of resilience. When all you had was dry goods and determination. As the Great Depression rolled on, families across America faced a recurring question: what can we make with what little we have? And from that daily struggle emerged the noodle and breadcrumb skillet bake, a resourceful creation born from pantry scraps and clever thinking. At its core, this dish was as simple as it was brilliant. Dry egg noodles were one of the cheapest bulk items available at the time, sold by the pound in cloth sacks. Once boiled to tenderness, they were tossed with whatever bits were on hand, usually fried onions, leftover bacon grease, or even just a touch of lard. But the real magic happened when the noodles met the skillet. Cooks would transfer the mixture to a cast iron pan, layer it with a sparse handful of homemade breadcrumbs, made from stale bread saved religiously, and let it bake until the top crisped into a golden crust. The result was a comforting, crunchy-topped noodle dish that made even the most modest dinner feel hearty. What made this dish so cherished wasn't just the flavor, it was the ingenuity. Many homes lacked ovens, so everything had to be cooked over a flame. This dish worked perfectly on a stovetop or open fire, making it ideal for coal towns, tenant farms, and city apartments where resources were scarce. Some added a dash of dried herbs from the windowsill garden, others stirred in rehydrated peas or a spoonful of cottage cheese if they had any. And just like that, every version became personal, flavored by both necessity and love. While it never graced the covers of cookbooks, the noodle and breadcrumb skillet bake sustained thousands during America's leanest years. It turned bare cupboards into full stomachs and left memories that still echo through old family kitchens. When you had no meat, but still made a meal. By the mid-1930s, meat had become a rare luxury in many American homes. But hunger waits for no paycheck. And that's exactly where the humble tomato cracker stew stepped in, stretching pennies and lifting spirits across struggling families. This forgotten dish wasn't born in a test kitchen or written in a glossy magazine. It came from necessity, scrawled into the margins of worn cookbooks and passed down by word of mouth, whispered from one neighbor to the next. It was a soup, a stew, a filling bowl of warmth, made from two of the cheapest things a household could find: canned tomatoes and stale saltine crackers. Cooks would start by heating a pot over a coal or wood fire, pouring in home-canned tomatoes or government-issued rations when available. The acidity of the tomatoes gave the stew its bold base, while onions or garlic, if they could be found, added depth. Water, a pinch of salt, and dried herbs from the garden helped build flavor. Then came the crackers. Crushed by hand, those stale saltines were dropped into the bubbling pot. They softened into the broth, thickening it until it became more stew than soup. Some added milk or even a bit of evaporated milk to mellow the flavor. The stew was ladled into bowls and eaten with a spoon, or scooped up with more crackers, if any remained. Despite its simplicity, tomato cracker stew held more than just calories. It held pride. It was a meal that required no meat, no cheese, no expensive ingredients, just cleverness, community, and courage. You'd hear stories of mothers feeding 6 children with one pot of this stew, of neighbors sharing crackers when someone's pantry ran dry. In some towns, this stew was served at soup kitchens by volunteers who had once eaten it themselves. And though it's vanished from modern menus, the legacy of tomato cracker stew lingers in our collective culinary memory. By the end of a long week in Depression-era America, most working-class families faced a familiar challenge: bare cupboards, tired parents, and the need to stretch every remaining scrap into something warm and filling. This is where the miracle of the end-of-the-week hash truly came to life. Hash wasn't just a dish, it was a symbol of survival. Nothing went to waste. Bits of leftover meat, be it beef, pork, or even salted fish, were finely chopped alongside potatoes, onions, and sometimes turnips or carrots. Everything was mixed together and pan-fried until crispy on the edges and soft in the middle. It wasn't fancy. It didn't have an exact recipe. But it had heart. What made this hash so important was its adaptability. It changed from house to house and week to week, depending entirely on what remained. Some versions had a dash of leftover gravy poured on top. Others cracked an egg into the pan to stretch it even further. Many working-class mothers would mix in crumbs of stale bread to bulk it up, feeding a family of 6 with little more than yesterday's scraps. Beyond its ingredients, hash told a deeper story. It was the food of exhausted coal miners, factory workers, and single mothers, the unsung recipe that quietly filled bellies without praise or recognition. It was never written in a cookbook. It didn't appear on menus. But it kept people going. And that made it unforgettable. Today, this forgotten casserole reminds us of a time when food wasn't just nourishment, it was resilience. The end-of-the-week hash stood as a humble monument to thrift, creativity, and love in America's toughest kitchens. It may have faded from our plates, but its legacy still simmers in the roots of our cooking traditions.